The morning sun cast long shadows across the private airport terminal as Sarah Mitchell's sleek Tesla Model X pulled into the exclusive parking area. The clock on her dashboard showed 7:45 a.m., perfect timing for her 8:30 a.m. flight to Chicago. Sarah was used to being early. It was one of the many habits that had helped her climb to the position of senior vice president at Mitchell and Associates Investment Banking by the age of 35. Through the tinted windows of her car, she could see the usual morning activities of the private terminal. Staff members in crisp uniforms moved efficiently about their duties, while a few other passengers, mostly older men in expensive suits, made their way inside. Sarah took a moment to check her appearance in the rearview mirror. Her dark skin glowed with quiet confidence, and her carefully styled hair was arranged in a professional updo. The navy blue designer suit she wore was impeccable. Another day, another important meeting with investors. As she gathered her things, Sarah went through her mental checklist. Her crocodile leather briefcase contained all the necessary documentation: flight manifest, identification, company credentials, and even the papers showing her ownership of the private jet she was about to board. After years of experience in the corporate world, she had learned to always be over-prepared. Stepping out of her car, Sarah noticed something slightly off. The security guard at the entrance was watching her with an unusual intensity. She had flown from this terminal dozens of times over the past few years, but she had never seen this particular guard before. His name tag read Thomas Reynolds, and there was something in his stance that made Sarah's well-tuned instincts prickle with awareness. Sarah walked toward the entrance with the measured pace of someone who belonged there. The clicking of her Louboutin heels against the pavement created a steady rhythm as she approached. Other passengers were entering without any fuss. A silver-haired man in a gray suit had just walked through with barely a glance from the guard. The morning air was crisp, and Sarah could smell the distinct scent of jet fuel mixed with the coffee from the terminal's premium cafe. A private jet took off in the distance, its engines creating a familiar roar that had become almost comforting to her over the years. This was her world, one she had worked incredibly hard to be part of. As she neared the entrance, Sarah reached for her phone to check a message that had just buzzed through. It was from her assistant confirming that everything was prepared for the Chicago meeting. The investment opportunity they were about to present could mean a $50 million deal for their firm. She smiled slightly, already mentally preparing for the presentation. Several staff members she recognized nodded respectfully as she approached. "Good morning, Ms. Mitchell," called out Maria, one of the regular receptionists. Sarah returned the greeting with a warm smile. She had always made it a point to know the names of the people who kept the terminal running smoothly, and they appreciated her for it. Just as she was about to reach the door, she noticed Guard Reynolds straightening up, his hand moving to rest near his security belt. The movement was subtle but deliberate. Sarah had seen this body language before: the slightly aggressive stance, the way his eyes narrowed, the almost imperceptible shake of his head. After 15 years in the financial world, she had unfortunately become quite familiar with these signs. Sarah took a deep breath and maintained her professional demeanor. In her briefcase, she had every document imaginable to prove she belonged here. Years of experience had taught her to always be prepared for moments like these. As she reached for the door handle, she could see Reynolds moving to intersect her path. The morning sun continued to climb in the sky, promising a beautiful day for flying. Other passengers continued to arrive, some in luxury cars, others in hired limousines. The private terminal buzzed with its usual exclusive energy. But as Sarah stood at the threshold, she knew the next few moments would be anything but usual. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin slightly, and prepared to face what was coming with the same grace and professionalism that had carried her to the top of her field. Guard Thomas Reynolds stepped directly into Sarah's path, his hand still resting near his security belt. The morning's peaceful atmosphere suddenly felt heavy with tension. Other travelers continued to stream past them, most completely unaware of what was about to unfold. "Excuse me, ma'am," Reynolds said, emphasizing the word ma'am in a way that made it sound more like an accusation than a courtesy. "I'm going to need to see some identification." His voice was loud enough to draw attention from nearby passengers, who slowed their pace to observe the interaction. Sarah reached for her ID with practiced calm. She had been in similar situations before, though usually not at this terminal where she was a regular client. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady and professional. "I have all my documentation right here." but before she could open her briefcase, Reynolds held up his hand. "First, I need to know your purpose for being at this private terminal." He glanced pointedly at her Tesla in the parking lot, then back at her expensive suit, as if trying to find something out of place. A small crowd had begun to gather, maintaining a polite distance but clearly interested in the scene unfolding before them. Maria, the receptionist who had greeted Sarah earlier, stood up behind her desk, concern evident on her face. "I'm here for my 8:30 flight to Chicago," Sarah explained, keeping her voice level. She reached again for her briefcase, but Reynolds stepped even closer, his body language becoming more aggressive. "Ma'am, this is a private terminal," he said slowly, as if speaking to someone who might not understand. "These flights are reserved for—" He paused, searching for words, "specific clients." Sarah could feel her heart beating faster, but years of handling difficult board meetings had taught her to maintain her composure. "Yes, I'm aware," she replied. "I'm a regular client here. If you'll allow me to show you my documentation." "Listen," Reynolds interrupted, his voice dropping lower but becoming more hostile. "I don't want any trouble here. Maybe you're confused about which terminal you need. The main airport is about 3 miles down the road." By now, more people had stopped to watch. A young man in a suit nearly dropped his coffee cup as he slowed to observe the confrontation. Two airport staff members whispered to each other, looking uncomfortable but unsure whether to intervene. Sarah straightened her spine, standing her full height in her heels. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, reading his name tag again, "I assure you I'm exactly where I need to be. I've flown from this terminal dozens of times. Now, if you'll please look at my documentation." "Ma'am," Reynolds cut her off again, "I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know who belongs here and who doesn't." His implication hung heavily in the air. A few gasps could be heard from the onlookers. Sarah felt a familiar weight in her chest, the kind that came with fighting battles she shouldn't have to fight. But she had learned long ago that losing her temper would only make things worse. Instead, she pulled out her phone. "Since you won't look at my documentation," she said calmly, "perhaps you'd like me to call the terminal manager, or better yet, should I contact my company's legal department?" She kept her voice professional but firm. Reynolds' face reddened slightly, but he stood his ground. "Go ahead," he said, crossing his arms. "But until I'm satisfied that you belong here, you're not getting past this point." The terminal's usual morning bustle had grown quiet. Even the sound of coffee being made and phones ringing seemed muted compared to the tension in the air. Sarah could see people recording the incident on their phones, their expressions a mix of shock and disapproval. Just then, a young intern from her firm, who happened to be at the terminal for another flight, recognized her. Sarah could see the realization dawning on his face as he looked between her and the guard. The next few moments would change everything, but for now, Sarah stood her ground, her documentation ready, facing yet another barrier that should never have existed. The young intern, James Parker, stepped forward from the growing crowd. His voice shook slightly with nervousness, but he spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Ms. Mitchell, Ms. Sarah Mitchell, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to say thank you again for the opportunity to work at Mitchell and Associates. Your leadership meeting yesterday was incredible." Guard Reynolds' head snapped toward the intern, then back to Sarah. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with more authority. "Sir, please step back. This is a security matter." But James continued, his confidence growing. "Oh, I'm sorry, but I thought everyone here knew Ms. Mitchell. She's our CEO. Her company owns half the private jets that fly out of this terminal." He looked confused, glancing between Sarah and the guard. The crowd's whispers grew louder. Several phones were now recording the scene, their cameras pointed directly at Reynolds. Sarah remained perfectly still, her briefcase still in her hand, watching as the situation unfolded. "I don't care who she claims to be," Reynolds said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Protocol states that all passengers must be properly verified before entering the terminal." Sarah spoke then, her voice calm but carrying across the now silent terminal. "You're absolutely right about protocol, Mr. Reynolds. That's why I've been trying to show you my documentation for the past 10 minutes." She opened her briefcase slowly, maintaining eye contact with the guard. Maria, the receptionist, had finally had enough. She walked around her desk and approached them. Thomas, what are you doing? Ms. Mitchell flies out of here 3 times a week. She's one of our most valued clients. Reynolds' face had turned a deep shade of red. I haven't seen her before. We need to be careful about security. His words trailed off as Sarah began laying out her documents on the nearby counter. First came her pilot-approved flight manifest for the 8:30 a.m. departure to Chicago. Then her company ID showing her position as CEO of Mitchell and Associates Investment Banking. Following that, she placed down her aircraft ownership papers, showing she owned not just one, but 3 private jets housed at this very terminal. The crowd had grown larger. Some of the onlookers were shaking their heads in disgust at Reynolds' behavior. Others were typing furiously on their phones, likely sharing the incident on social media. A few older businessmen who recognized Sarah from various corporate events stood watching with concerned expressions. "Mr. Reynolds," Sarah said, her voice still professional but now carrying an edge of steel, "I've shown you my documentation. I've had another passenger and your colleague verify my identity. I have a meeting in Chicago in 3 hours that involves a $50 million deal. So I'm going to ask you one last time. Will you let me board my flight, or should I call your supervisor?" Reynolds stared at the documents, then at the crowd, then back at Sarah. Sweat had begun to form on his forehead. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically, but he seemed unable to back down gracefully. I still need to verify these with my supervisor," he stammered, reaching for his radio. "That won't be necessary," a new voice called out. Everyone turned to see the airport's chief of security, Mr. Howard, striding quickly toward them. His face was a mask of professional concern as he took in the scene, the scattered documents, the recording phones, the embarrassed guard, and Sarah's composed but determined stance. The morning sun now streamed fully through the terminal's glass walls, highlighting the tension in the air. Sarah checked her watch. 15 minutes had passed since this confrontation began. 15 minutes of facing discrimination at a terminal she partly owned. As Mr. Howard approached, she knew this incident was far from over, but the next phase would be about creating positive change rather than just confronting ignorance. Mr. Howard, the chief of security, moved through the crowd with quick, purposeful steps. He was a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and years of experience handling difficult situations. As soon as he reached the scene, his eyes went straight to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying both respect and concern, "I just got word of what's happening here. Please accept my deepest apologies for this situation." He turned to face guard Reynolds, whose face had lost all its previous confidence. "Thomas, step aside. Now." Reynolds took 2 steps back, his hands fidgeting with his security belt. The crowd of onlookers remained, their phones still recording every moment of what had become a viral-worthy incident. "John," Sarah addressed Mr. Howard by his first name, maintaining her professional composure, "I understand the need for security protocols. What I don't understand is the refusal to even look at my documentation." She gestured to the papers still spread out on the counter. Mr. Howard picked up the documents one by one, though he clearly didn't need to verify them. "Ms. Mitchell, you've been flying from this terminal for what, 3 years now?" 4 years, 2 months, Sarah corrected him. "And I'd never experienced anything like this here before." She glanced at her watch again. Her Chicago meeting was still achievable, but time was becoming a concern. The young intern, James, stepped forward again. "Sir, I have everything on video, including when Mr. Reynolds suggested Ms. Mitchell should go to the main airport instead." His words caused a fresh wave of murmurs through the crowd. Mr. Howard's expression darkened. "Thomas, my office. Now." He turned to another security guard who had arrived on the scene. "Dave, escort Mr. Reynolds to my office and make sure he stays there." As Reynolds was led away, Sarah gathered her documents back into her briefcase. The morning sun now filled the terminal completely, making the whole scene feel exposed and raw. Several other passengers who had been delayed by the incident were now moving quickly to their gates, throwing sympathetic glances in Sarah's direction. Maria, the receptionist, approached with a cup of coffee, Sarah's usual order. "I'm so sorry, Ms. Mitchell. I should have called Mr. Howard sooner." Her hands shook slightly as she offered the coffee. Sarah accepted the coffee with a gentle smile. "Thank you, Maria. You tried to help, and I appreciate that." She turned to Mr. Howard, who was already on his phone, presumably dealing with the fallout of the incident. John, Sarah said, causing him to look up from his call. I'd like to discuss implementing some changes here at the terminal. Her voice was firm but constructive. Not just disciplinary action, but real, systematic changes. Mr. Howard nodded seriously. Of course, Ms. Mitchell, whatever you think is necessary. We can set up a meeting for when you return from Chicago. The crowd had started to disperse, though many were still watching from a distance. James, the intern, approached Sarah one last time. Ms. Mitchell, would you like me to send the video to our legal department? Sarah considered this for a moment. The easy path would be to let her lawyers handle everything, to have Reynolds fired, maybe even sue the terminal. But she had built her career on finding solutions, not just punishing problems. No, James, she said finally, but please save it. We might need it for training purposes. She turned back to Mr. Howard. I want to be part of the solution here. This isn't just about one guard or one incident. It's about making sure this never happens to anyone else. The terminal's usual morning bustle had resumed, but something had changed. As Sarah was finally escorted to her gate by Mr. Howard himself, she could feel the weight of what had just happened, and the responsibility of what would come next. Her Chicago meeting would have to include a phone call to her HR department. It was time to develop a new training program, one that might help prevent another morning like this. Sarah sat in her private jet's comfortable leather seat, her laptop open in front of her. The pilot had just announced they were cleared for takeoff, but her mind was still processing the events at the terminal. Through the jet's window, she could see the morning sun reflecting off other aircraft, creating a golden glow across the tarmac. Her phone buzzed with notifications. The incident had already made its way to social media. James, the intern, hadn't posted his video, but others in the crowd had shared their recordings. #PrivatTerminalRacism was trending locally, and Sarah's name was being mentioned in hundreds of posts. Ms. Mitchell, her flight attendant, Rebecca, approached with concern in her eyes. I heard about what happened in the terminal. Is there anything you need? Sarah shook her head with a gentle smile. Just a cup of green tea, please. And maybe some time to think. She turned back to her laptop, where she had opened a new document. The title read, Terminal Security Training Program, Draft Proposal. As the jet began its takeoff roll, Sarah's phone rang. It was Marcus Thompson, her company's head of HR. Sarah, I just saw the videos. Do you want us to release a statement? Our social media team is getting flooded with messages. No statement yet, Sarah replied, her voice steady. I want to turn this into something positive. Can you set up a meeting for tomorrow? I have some ideas about expanding our corporate training programs. The jet lifted smoothly into the air, leaving behind the morning's tension. Sarah looked out the window, watching the city shrink beneath her. She thought about Guard Reynolds' face when he realized who she was, about Maria's attempt to help, about James' quick thinking with the video. Her laptop chimed with an email from Mr. Howard. Ms. Mitchell, I've just finished my meeting with Officer Reynolds. He admits his actions were inappropriate and showed clear bias. I know you requested no immediate termination, but I need your input on next steps. Also, the terminal's board of directors would like to meet with you upon your return. Joan Howard. Sarah began typing her response, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. John, thank you for handling this promptly. Instead of termination, I propose we use this as an opportunity for change. I'm drafting a comprehensive training program that could benefit all terminal staff. Would the board be interested in implementing this across all their locations? Sarah Mitchell. The jet reached its cruising altitude, and Rebecca returned with the green tea. Ms. Mitchell, your Chicago presentation is ready on the screen whenever you'd like to review it. She paused, then added, and thank you for handling that situation the way you did. My younger sister works at another private terminal. This could help her too. Sarah took a sip of her tea, letting its warmth calm her further. Her phone buzzed again, this time with messages of support from other business leaders who had heard about the incident. Many were offering to implement whatever training program she developed in their own companies. Opening her presentation for the Chicago meeting, Sarah added a new slide at the end. Proposed industry-wide initiative, security and inclusion training. The $50 million deal she was flying to discuss suddenly seemed like just the beginning of something much bigger. The flight attendant's phone buzzed with a news alert. She glanced at it, then looked at Sarah with wide eyes. Ms. Mitchell, the video has gone national. Major news networks are picking up the story. Sarah nodded calmly. She had expected this. Her phone rang again. Her company's public relations director this time. But before taking the call, she finished typing one more line in her proposal. Goal: transform a moment of discrimination into a movement of lasting change. Looking out at the clouds surrounding the jet, Sarah felt a mix of emotions. Frustration at having faced such discrimination, determination to create change, and hope for what might come from all this. The Chicago skyline was still 2 hours away, giving her time to refine her ideas. This flight had started with confronting discrimination, but it would end with planning a solution. The Chicago meeting room fell silent as Sarah finished her presentation. The $50 million investment deal she had come to discuss had somehow transformed into something much bigger. On the large screen behind her, the final slide still showed her newly added proposal. Industry-wide Security and Inclusion Training Initiative. Richard Bennett, the head of the investment group, leaned forward in his chair. His gray hair and expensive suit matched most of the other executives in the room, but his expression was different, genuinely interested rather than just politely attentive. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, adjusting his glasses, "I came here today expecting to discuss a standard investment opportunity. Instead, you presented something truly revolutionary." He gestured to his tablet, where the viral video of her morning confrontation was paused. "You took what happened to you this morning and turned it into a business opportunity that could change the entire private aviation industry." Sarah stood confidently at the front of the room, her navy blue suit as crisp as it had been that morning. "Mr. Bennett, what happened today wasn't unique. It was just caught on camera." She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics about discrimination in private aviation. "These numbers tell us we have a system-wide problem, and system-wide problems need system-wide solutions." The room buzzed with quiet conversation as the executives discussed among themselves. Sarah's phone vibrated in her pocket, probably another news outlet requesting an interview. The story had exploded across social media during her flight, with hashtag #PrivAvTerminalRacism now trending nationally. Jennifer Chen, the group's chief financial officer, spoke up next. "Your proposed training program would require significant investment from private terminals and aviation companies. What makes you think they'll participate?" Sarah smiled confidently. "Because in the 3 hours since this incident went viral, I've received commitments from 12 major companies willing to implement our program." She pulled up her email on the screen, showing messages from various industry leaders. They understand that this isn't just about doing the right thing. It's about protecting their businesses in a world where every interaction can go viral. The room grew quiet again as Sarah clicked through more slides, showing her detailed plan. The training program would be comprehensive: implicit bias recognition, professional interaction protocols, situation de-escalation, and proper documentation verification procedures. Everything would be backed by data and real-world scenarios. "And here's the investment opportunity," Sarah continued, her voice steady and persuasive. "My company will develop and implement these training programs. We project a return of 300% over 5 years, not just from program fees, but from increased business as private aviation becomes more inclusive and accessible." Richard Bennett nodded slowly, then looked around the room at his fellow investors. Something passed between them, a silent agreement. He turned back to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, standing up, "we came here prepared to invest $50 million in your company's expansion plans. Instead, we'd like to propose $100 million to launch this initiative properly." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Sarah maintained her professional composure, but inside, she felt a wave of satisfaction. Her morning of confronting discrimination was turning into an afternoon of creating real change. "One condition," Jennifer Chen added, standing as well. "We want this program to go beyond just private aviation. These principles could apply to any high-end service industry." Sarah picked up her presentation remote, clicking to her final slide, one she had prepared during the flight but hadn't planned to show. The title read, "Phase 2, Expanding Beyond Aviation." "Ms. Chen," Sarah replied with a knowing smile, "great minds think alike. Should we discuss the details over dinner?" As the meeting room filled with approving nods and excited conversation, Sarah's phone buzzed again. It was a message from Mr. Howard at the terminal. Board meeting scheduled for tomorrow. They're ready to make changes. You've started something big here. Sarah looked out the Chicago meeting room window at the city skyline. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows between the buildings. Sometimes, she thought, the worst moments led to the best opportunities for change. Guard Reynolds' discrimination had tried to block her path this morning. Instead, it had opened a door to something much more important. 1 week had passed since the incident at the private terminal. Sarah sat in her office on the 42nd floor of the Mitchell and Associates building, reviewing the final draft of the new training program. The city stretched out below her window, but her attention was focused on her computer screen, where the morning's news played in a small window. In a groundbreaking move, the news anchor reported, "The private aviation industry is implementing sweeping changes following last week's viral discrimination incident. Leading this change is Sarah Mitchell, the CEO who turned a moment of discrimination into a $100 million initiative for industry reform." Sarah muted the video and turned to face Marcus Thompson, our HR director, who sat across from her desk. "How are the numbers looking for the pilot program?" Marcus smiled as he pulled up the statistics on his tablet. "Better than we expected. 30 private terminals have already signed up for the first phase of training, and we're getting interest from luxury hotels, high-end retailers, and even some banking institutions." There was a knock at the door, and James, the intern who had helped during the incident, entered with a stack of papers. "Ms. Mitchell, the latest feedback reports from the terminal's first training session just came in." His confidence had grown over the past week, especially after Sarah had promoted him to assistant project manager for the new initiative. Sarah gestured for him to sit down. "What's the response from the security team?" James spread the papers across her desk. "Overwhelmingly positive. Even Officer Reynolds." He paused, looking uncertain about mentioning the name. "It's okay, James," Sarah assured him. "What about Officer Reynolds?" "He's actually become one of the program's strongest advocates. His personal account of how his biases affected his judgment that day has become a powerful part of the training sessions." James handed her a particular feedback form. "He's requesting to be part of the training team that will visit other terminals." Sarah read through Reynolds' feedback form. His words showed genuine remorse and, more importantly, understanding. He had written about how the incident had forced him to confront his own biases and how he wanted to help others recognize and overcome theirs. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Howard. "Changes already visible at the terminal. Staff morale up. Passenger feedback excellent. Board wants to discuss expanding training to all our locations nationwide." Marcus cleared his throat. "There's more. Remember those videos from that morning?" He pulled up a social media report. "They're being used in diversity training programs at major corporations across the country. The hashtag has evolved from hashtag #PrivatTerminalRacism to hashtag #TransformDiscrimination." Sarah stood and walked to her window, looking out at the city below. A private jet traced its way across the sky, reminding her of that morning a week ago. "Any word from the investment group about Phase 2? Jennifer Chen called this morning," Marcus replied. "They want to fast-track the expansion into other industries. The return projections have increased by 50% based on the initial response." James spoke up again, his voice excited. "And the educational sector is reaching out too. 3 universities want to incorporate our training program into their business and hospitality management curricula." Sarah turned back to face them, a determined smile on her face. "Schedule a meeting with the development team. If we're going to expand this quickly, we need to make sure the program maintains its integrity. This isn't about just checking boxes, it's about creating real change." She picked up Reynolds' feedback form again, reading his closing words. "What happened that morning changed 2 lives, Ms. Mitchell's and mine, but through this program, we had the chance to change thousands more." The afternoon sun streamed through her office windows, catching the frame of her newly hung photo, a picture taken just yesterday at the terminal. In it, Sarah stood with the entire security team, including Reynolds, all wearing pins that read "Transform Discrimination into Education." The photo's caption read, "Change starts with one moment, but it grows through understanding." Her assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Ms. Mitchell, the Today Show is on line 1. They'd like to feature your story and the training initiative on tomorrow's morning segment. 3 months after the incident, Sarah's private jet touched down at the same terminal where everything had started. The morning sun painted the sky in familiar golden hues, but much had changed since that pivotal day. As her car pulled up to the terminal entrance, she noticed the new digital sign above the door. "Welcome to Hampton Private Terminal, where respect takes flight." Sarah stepped out of her car, wearing a deep purple suit that reflected her success. The terminal staff, all wearing new uniforms with the Transform Discrimination Program pins, greeted her with genuine warmth. Maria, the receptionist who had tried to help her that day, now sat at an upgraded desk marked Customer Relations Manager. "Good morning, Ms. Mitchell," Maria called out with a bright smile. "Officer Reynolds is waiting in the training room with the new batch of security personnel." Sarah nodded, remembering how far they'd all come. The training room, a new addition to the terminal, had been her idea, a dedicated space for ongoing education and improvement. As she walked through the terminal, she noticed the subtle but significant changes. Diverse artwork on the walls, multilingual welcome signs, and staff members from various backgrounds. Entering the training room, she found Thomas Reynolds standing before a group of 20 new security officers. On the screen behind him played the video from that infamous morning, but now it was part of something bigger, a comprehensive training module on recognition and prevention of unconscious bias. "And that's why we check documents first, assumptions never," Reynolds was saying to his attentive audience. He spotted Sarah and straightened up. "Everyone, please welcome Ms. Mitchell, the person who taught me the most important lesson of my career." The room broke into applause as Sarah walked to the front. Looking at the diverse group of trainees, she felt a sense of accomplishment. The $100 million initiative had grown to $300 million in just 3 months, with over 200 private terminals nationwide now participating in the program. "Officer Reynolds," Sarah addressed him with a genuine smile, "how are our new recruits doing?" "They're exceptional, Ms. Mitchell," he replied, the shame of their first encounter long transformed into dedication to the cause. "We're actually implementing that role-play scenario you suggested, where they practice handling high-stress situations without letting bias affect their judgment." Sarah turned to address the group. 3 months ago, I stood at this terminal's entrance, facing discrimination that could have ended very differently. She gestured to the screen where the video played silently. But today, that moment has led to over 5,000 security personnel being trained across the country. More importantly, it's led to real change in how we treat each other. She pulled up the latest statistics on the screen. Customer satisfaction at participating terminals had increased by 45%. Discrimination complaints had dropped by 78%. The program had expanded beyond aviation into hotels, restaurants, and retail spaces. 3 major universities had made it part of their business school curriculum. But the numbers aren't the whole story, Sarah continued. The real success is in the daily interactions that don't make the news. It's in the respectful greetings, the proper document checks, the professional treatment that everyone deserves. James, no longer an intern but now the National Training Coordinator, entered the room with more good news. "Ms. Mitchell, the International Aviation Authority just called. They want to implement our program globally." Sarah looked around the room, at Reynolds who had transformed from an obstacle to an advocate, at the eager new trainees ready to do better, at James who had grown so much professionally. The morning sun streamed through the windows, just like it had 3 months ago, but everything else had changed. "You know what this means?" she asked the room. "It means that one difficult moment, handled with dignity and determination, can spark change across the world." She picked up a new training manual from the desk. "Now, let's get to work. We have a lot more minds to open and attitudes to transform." As she began the day's training session, Sarah smiled at the framed motto on the wall, the same one now hanging in hundreds of terminals worldwide. Every moment is a chance for change. That difficult morning hadn't just ended the drama. It started a revolution in how people treat each other, one security check at a time.